As I testify before the committee today, I want to be clear. I stand by my decisions as special counsel, including the decision to bring charges against President Trump. Our investigation developed proof beyond a reasonable doubt that President Trump engaged in criminal activity.
The room didn't feel like a hearing. It felt like an alibi being rehearsed in public. Because the moment special counsel Jack Smith sat down in front of that committee, the objective was already written in the fluorescent lights overhead. This wasn't about facts. It wasn't about the granular reality of January 6th. And it certainly wasn't about the high-minded concept of accountability. It was about erasing memory in real time. It was a forensic attempt to launder history through procedural noise until the crime itself felt abstract, distant, debatable. This wasn't oversight, it was damage control. And once you understand that the goal is the destruction of shared reality, everything else, the shouting, the grandstanding, the bad faith questioning, it all snaps into a terrifyingly clear focus. Let's strip this down to the bone. Jack Smith did not show up because the current iteration of the Republican Party suddenly discovered a latent passion for the intricacies of constitutional law. He showed up because they needed a spectacle, a performance, a piece of digital content they could chop up, repackage, and distribute to a base that has been conditioned to see the law not as a shield for the innocent, but as a weapon for the powerful. They needed something they could point to and say, "See, we challenged the deep state." They needed a soundbite loud enough to drown out the simplest and most dangerous truth of January 6th, that it was not spontaneous, it was not confused, and it was not a riot that simply got out of hand. It was the final move in a months-long, coordinated effort to override an election that had already been litigated, certified, and exhausted in every lawful forum available to the American experiment. 5 years ago, the plan was already failing under its own weight. We forget the timeline because the chaos was designed to make us forget. Every court challenge had collapsed, often under the gavel of Republican-appointed judges. Every recount had confirmed the result. Every serious lawyer involved in the inner circle knew the truth. They were losing because they didn't have the votes, and they didn't have the evidence. And that's the detail that matters most. January 6th wasn't born of uncertainty. It wasn't born of a genuine concern about voter integrity. It was born of desperation. It was a last procedural choke point where the system could be forced into a state of paralysis, because if certification could be delayed, if it could be questioned just long enough to create a constitutional vacuum, then chaos could be weaponized. And chaos in a fragile constitutional system is the ultimate leverage. Congress was the final firewall. That's why that day mattered. That's why the pressure campaign focused there. That's why the language shifted from legal challenges to delay tactics. And that's why, when violence erupted, it wasn't some random outburst of populist anger. It followed the internal logic of the strategy. Stop the count, interrupt the process, force an outcome through disruption. This wasn't an outburst. It was an escalation. It was the physical manifestation of a legal theory that had failed in every courtroom in the land. And here's the part that they now desperately want you to forget. In the immediate aftermath, they knew it. Almost all of them. The statements poured out within hours of the broken glass and the sirens. We heard the condemnations. We heard the calls for accountability. We heard the language of law and order applied to the people who had just smashed the windows of the Republic. They said the quiet part out loud because the shock hadn't worn off yet. The danger was still visible. The smoke hadn't cleared. In that brief window, before the political calculus recalculated the cost of honesty, the truth was unavoidable. But truth has a short shelf life inside a political movement built on the foundation of fear. As soon as Donald Trump stopped being radioactive to the donor class and the primary voters, the calculus changed. Silence turned into hedging. Hedging turned into revisionism. Revisionism turned into a full-blown conspiracy culture. This didn't happen because new facts emerged. No new evidence of fraud was uncovered. No secret cabal was revealed. The story changed because power returned to its gravitational center. Trump didn't need to convince them that January 6th was justified. He only needed to make opposing him more dangerous than defending the indefensible. So the story shifted. It had to. Because acknowledging what January 6th actually was would mean acknowledging complicity. And complicity carries consequences, moral ones, legal ones, and historical ones. So instead of confronting the act, they attacked the process that investigated it. Instead of disputing the evidence, they disputed the legitimacy of the investigators. This is an old tactic, one we've seen in every crumbling democracy of the last century. Authoritarian systems don't bother disproving crimes. They simply discredit the people documenting them. That's what you saw at the Jack Smith hearing. Not one serious challenge to the substance of the DC indictment, no meaningful engagement with the timeline of the fake electors scheme, no refutation of the documented pressure campaigns on state officials in Georgia or Arizona. Instead, you saw procedural smoke, appointment arguments, jurisdiction games, attacks on the January 6th committee itself. Because if you can convince enough people that the referee is corrupt, you never have to talk about the score. You never have to explain why you were trying to fix the game in the first place. Let's talk about that committee, because this is where the dishonesty becomes almost surgical. The current narrative is that it was a partisan witch hunt, that Republicans were excluded. They weren't. The leadership made a cold, strategic decision to withdraw their nominees in an attempt to delegitimize the process before it even began. That wasn't exclusion. That was sabotage. You don't get to refuse participation and then complain about your absence. That's not how institutional accountability works. That's how bad faith actors operate. They create a vacancy and then cite that vacancy as proof of a conspiracy. And the reason this matters is simple. The committee's findings didn't rely on ideology. They relied on documents, testimony from the people inside the room, timelines, text messages, call logs. This is evidence that doesn't care about your party affiliation. It doesn't care who you voted for. It shows intent. It shows pressure. It shows knowledge of the illegality of the plan. That's why attacking the committee became a survival necessity, because attacking the facts directly was and remains impossible. So what do you do when the facts are immovable and the consequences are terrifying? You invent alternatives. You conjure ghosts, Antifa, federal agents, false flags, anything that moves responsibility somewhere else, anywhere else. Because the human mind is remarkably skilled at self-preservation. For many of these lawmakers, preserving their political future required burying their moral past. They had to create a world where they weren't the ones who stood by while the Capitol was stormed, but the victims of a weaponized government trying to hold them to account. Here's what doesn't get said often enough in the halls of Congress. Most of them know what happened. They aren't confused. They aren't misinformed. They're trapped. They are trapped between what they understand privately, the sheer weight of the evidence, and what they must perform publicly to survive in a MAGA-dominated ecosystem. And that tension corrodes a person. It fractures identity. It produces behavior that looks erratic, aggressive, and conspiratorial. Because living with unresolved moral dissonance is unbearable. So they externalize it. They attack the prosecutor, they deflect, they project their own willingness to abuse power onto the very people trying to protect the rule of law. That's why hearings like this feel unhinged. They aren't designed to discover truth, they're designed to soothe guilt. They provide psychological cover for a movement that can no longer justify its own actions. The tragedy is that the institution of Congress is being used as a form of group therapy for people who refuse to confront their own role in a democratic near miss. Zoom out for a moment, because this pattern is bigger than one prosecutor or one hearing. This is what democratic erosion looks like in its middle phase. It's not tanks in the streets. It's not a dramatic suspension of the Constitution. It is the slow, grinding normalization of unreality. It is a world where investigations are automatically witch hunts, where courts are rigged the moment they rule against you, and where accountability is rebranded as persecution. The goal of this rhetoric isn't to win a legal argument, it's to exhaust the public. It's to make the average citizen throw up their hands and say, I don't know who to believe. Once truth feels subjective, the person with the loudest microphone wins. We've seen this before. We saw it in the decay of the Roman Republic. We saw it in the interwar period in Europe. We see it today in modern Hungary and Poland. The details change, the language shifts, but the architecture of the collapse remains the same. Discredit the institutions, flood the zone with alternative narratives, demand loyalty to a person over loyalty to the law, and when the consequences finally approach, scream bias until the system flinches. This isn't innovation, it's replication. And the most dangerous part of it all is how mundane it starts to feel, how routine. That's why the legal dimension, the actual cases Jack Smith is overseeing, matters so much. Because the law is the only place where narratives are forced to collide with reality. Obstruction doesn't care about your talking points. Due process doesn't bend to your grievances. Constitutional mechanisms exist precisely to withstand emotional and political pressure. When those mechanisms are attacked, not through direct repeal, but through constant corrosive delegitimization, the entire structure of our society weakens. The cases in DC and Florida are not about politics. They are about conduct. They are about whether power was abused. They are about whether the peaceful transfer of power, the very heartbeat of a democracy, was knowingly and maliciously undermined. That is why the response from the Trump camp has been so ferocious. Because if those questions are answered in a courtroom, under oath, with evidence that must meet the standard of law, the entire MAGA mythology collapses. This is the core fear. It's not exposure. Exposure has already happened. The fear is finality. The fear is a definitive legal record that cannot be spun, cannot be reframed as an opinion, and will exist long after the current news cycle has expired. That is what terrifies them, because history is written from records, not from rallies. A court verdict is a permanent mark on the timeline of a nation. Donald Trump understands this better than almost anyone. He has always been a man obsessed with image, with dominance, with the illusion of winning. January 6th shattered that illusion in a way that no election loss ever could. It revealed a loss so undeniable that it required the use of force and fraud to contest. For a man built entirely on the projection of success, that is an intolerable reality. So he returns to it, again and again. He forces the entire Republican Party to return to the scene of the crime with him. Not because it helps them win elections, we've seen it doesn't, but because it soothes him. Because if he can rewrite the history of that day, he can rewrite the story of himself. And everyone who depends on his approval, everyone who fears his base, must participate in that revision. They must become the architects of their own deception. This is why you see the glaring contradiction in the GOP today. The same people who once said, "We must move forward," are now the ones most obsessively relitigating the past. They don't care about the truth of what happened. They care about the verdict they fear is coming. As long as they keep talking, attacking, and distracting, they can pretend that the verdict is still pending. They can pretend the evidence doesn't exist. But it does. The record is there. The testimony is locked in. No amount of performative outrage in a committee room can erase the words of the people who were actually there. What these hearings really reveal isn't strength, it's panic. Pure, unadulterated panic. Because healthy systems don't attack prosecutors when they're innocent. They don't try to defund the DOJ when they have the facts on their side. You only attack the mechanism of accountability when you know that accountability is getting close. This isn't just about one man. It's about what kind of political culture survives him. It's about whether a major American party can learn from this moment or whether it will permanently calcify around a lie. It's about whether power in this country will become conditional on loyalty to a man or loyalty to a document. That is the fork in the road we are standing at right now. You can see the cost of choosing the wrong path already. You see lawmakers hollowed out by their own contradictions. You see institutions strained to the breaking point by constant assault. You see a public trust that has been eroded not by honest disagreement, but by deliberate, calculated deception. Once that trust collapses, rebuilding it doesn't take an election cycle. It takes generations. That is the real damage, not one lost election, but the corrosion of the belief that the process itself is real. The Jack Smith hearing mattered, not for what it revealed about the investigation, but for what it exposed about the opposition. It exposed a movement that can no longer defend its actions, only its grievances. It exposed a strategy that relies on confusion instead of coherence. And it exposed a leadership structure that prioritizes personal survival over institutional integrity. And yet, for all the noise, the American public has a remarkable capacity for recognizing theater. They understand deflection when they see it. They can feel the absence of substance. Every time these tactics are deployed, every time a hearing is turned into a circus, it educates more people than it deceives. Absurdity, like any other political commodity, has a shelf life. The irony is brutal. The more aggressively they dig, the clearer the hole becomes. Every attack on the legitimacy of the law reinforces the absolute necessity for the law to be enforced. Every conspiracy theory underscores the total lack of a factual defense. Every attempt to rewrite January 6th only ensures that it remains the defining, inescapable moment it already is. This isn't about revenge. This is about record-keeping. It is about ensuring that future generations inherit facts instead of myths. Children will learn about this period in history books. They will ask what happened. They will ask who knew the truth. And they will ask who tried to stop that truth from being told. That question is already being answered. It's being answered in transcripts, in court filings, and in the testimony of those who chose their country over their party. No hearing designed to intimidate a prosecutor can change that, because institutions, when they hold, outlast individuals. And the law, when it is enforced, outlasts the noise of the moment. So here is where we land. You don't have to obsess over the details of January 6th every day. You don't have to relive the trauma of that afternoon, but you cannot allow the memory of it to be erased, because erasure is the final victory of those who failed. Vigilance is the only price of preventing it. This isn't the last maneuver. It never is. But understanding the pattern is how you avoid being blindsided by the next one. The pattern is clear now. Power under threat lashes out. Truth under pressure gets louder. And history, despite every attempt to bend it toward the will of a single man, keeps a straight spine. Platforms bury content like this. If you found value here, hitting subscribe and like tells the algorithm that truth still matters. Be part of that signal.